you doing? And later on, switch on TV. They give me a news, they give half truths to me. They give us wise, they feed us lies. Now what we doing? Educate, they fabricate. And we sit back till it's too late.
The Radio Avenger. Rick Adams is on.
Good evening, folks. We are on the air here at RBN, and tonight we're back once again. And to open my program, I would like to go back to, a few thousand years ago, and my thoughts were on Jeremiah, the prophet. And I guess everybody now has heard of Jeremiah, and of course, you know the song Jeremiah Was a Bullfrog. Well, he had a lot to leap through here and a lot of talking to do and quite a bit of writing. And in, I believe it was chapter 9 of Jeremiah, he talks about, and like you can start with verse 2, and, you know, the enemies that we have all around us today are talking peace and yet preparing for war, talking lies, you know, and engaging in war. And they are very subtle about it, and they are very smooth talking. And so Jeremiah was writing, "Oh, that my head," you know, he says, "Oh, that I had in the wilderness a lodging place of wayfaring men, that I might have my people and go from them. For they are adulterers." You see, they were miscegenators. That's what they were doing. They were giving in marriage. And then he says, "An assembly of treacherous men, and they bend their tongues like their bow for lies. But they are not valiant for the truth upon the earth. For they proceed from evil to evil, and they know not me, saith the Lord." Ooh. You know, it sounds like today, doesn't it? Sounds just like today. He warns, "Take ye heed every one of his neighbor, and trust ye not in any brother. For every brother will utterly be suppliant, and every neighbor will walk with slanders. And they will deceive every one his neighbor, and will not speak the truth. They have taught their tongue to speak lies, and weary themselves to commit iniquity." That sounds pretty indictful, doesn't it? Well, I think about the people around us today, and within us, that is, within the tribe, who call themselves Israel and are not, and who are Israel and are not, and the community of brothers who are actually renegades, traitors, making fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness and deceivers. And they are preparing a fellowship with them. They are working with them directly and indirectly, seeking counsel with ungodly men, seeking counsel from the ungodly, working with the synagogue of Satan, hand in glove, hand in hand, trying to bring about this peace, this togetherness, this human understanding, as they call it. Now, we hear a lot about that today, particularly because of this United Nations, which was a communist invention, brought here on American soil by the Rockefellers, of course. And unsurprisingly enough, of course, we have this big gathering today, the convening of this particular session of the UN General Assembly, and we hear a lot of things that we haven't been made to hear by the media. A lot of things they're, of course, not covering. But one thing, of course, they prominently display in the Jewish media has been the president of Iran, the new president, who is known as Hassan Rouhani. And I just like to gather and watch, monitor the evening disinformation. And particularly I like to watch NBC, the National Baloney Company. For whatever reason, I just focus in on one lying team as opposed to the other. And I see the faces and the names and the voices of Andrea Mitchell and Chuck Todd and Mr. Engel and the rest of them. Ann Curry, of course, has been there now to Iran, managed to get in. And the Iranian parliament and the people now there under this president are, certainly giving off indication that Iran is no threat to anyone. And then they have quoted him as having referred to in his address as sanctions are a violent thing. Well, you can't argue with what he's saying. Rouhani is saying that sanctions really are an act of terror. And they are. When you impose sanctions unilaterally against a nation, as we did with Japan, and went much beyond sanctions, you're leading to war. And those sanctions are certainly an impediment to relationships with other countries. I'm not saying peace, but I'm saying it's certainly not the road to relationships with other countries, you see. And in the scriptures, we were told to have those relationships at peace unless we need to be prepared for war. And that was in King David's time and Solomon's time, and during all of the kings of the Old Testament. But never to seek to engage in war for the benefit of greed, of avarice, and based upon falsehoods. And yet today, this government, led by the Kenite government of Israel and the synagogue of Satan, has been on this path now for well over a century, as we know, before Israel even was created. You see, this Rockefeller, Rothschild imposed agenda, using the blood, the money, the wealth, the sustenance of our people and our land to enmesh themselves with greater wealth and at the same time continue to knock off their enemies. Of course, chief among their enemies today is Islam, as we know, Orthodox Islam, which of course seeks no compromises and no particular concessions to Zionism, to world Zionism, because it is where the Zionist regime is centered in the Middle East that is a perpetual warfare state, an expansionist state, that does, by its own inception, constitute a threat. A threat certainly carried out and already exercised against the indigenous Palestinians and those who existed with them in that whole region. But of course they will tell you a different story. They have a revisionist history that they want you to hear. Well, as Henry Ford said, history is bunk. It all depends on who owns the press. But I couldn't help but note, once again, that the most important thing to come tonight from this report out of Andrea Mitchell's, who is married, of course, to Mr. Greenspan, former chairman of the Fed, out of her mouth was the concern that this new leader of Iran give heed to the Holocaust. Oh my. Well, that told me everything. All right, folks. Time for a break. We'll come back. I will not blame them at all, and I certainly have a great deal of sympathy for them, and when they're scared, they can be manipulated, can't they? Well, they sure can, and that's exactly what happens when people are made to fear something. And it's fear that is the basis for the mind control and psyops that are right now being employed worldwide. But here particularly, we notice them here in the United States that are being used to manipulate the public into accepting a change in policy, a new way of life. And Wilson used it, of course, when he was preparing, and with the income tax and the Fed, and definitely the war, which followed the implementation of those two, to take America on a crusade, as he called it, a crusade for democracy and freedom in Europe. And, of course, he conditioned the American people through the controlled media at the time, the newspapers, that they would have to learn to do what the government required them to do if they wanted to be good citizens. And that was the mantra of the day. That was the propaganda of the day, that you needed to learn to jump when the government snaps its fingers. And of course, we had a great deal of new wave of immigration here in the United States at that time, settling in, most of them, of course, from Europe. And they did not want to heed Wilson's, socialist warmongering policies. But again, they didn't have much choice. And, we had a lot of draft dodgers, so to speak, resistors is the more appropriate term. And they resulted in jail for many, and also conscientious objection status for others. But in any event, now it's all about peace, isn't it? Now they're conditioning us to fear war so much, okay? The very warmongers that have brought us to this point are telling us that we should think about a new approach, peace and safety. And it's interesting that this key to all of this propaganda evolves around poor little innocent, tiny, defenseless Israel. And that's the centerpiece. You see, that's the cornerstone of all policy today in the world, which proves what the Scripture says. It proves perfectly what the Scripture says in the end time. And the Kenites, the sons of Cain, who run the world media, largely from top to bottom, are in a position to bombard us with these thoughts about Holocaust. Their Holocaust, they claim. And so everything now is based upon, will you do business with Jerusalem in order to do business with the United States, you see? See how it ties right into Revelation 18:3 we read last night? And, of course, all of these nations now are tied into the whore, the main whore, Babylon. And they must do business. They must acknowledge Israel before they can do any kind of business or diplomacy with the United States. More importantly, they must acknowledge Judaism, Zionism, and most importantly, the cornerstone of those lies, which is the Holocaust. Unless you embrace them, you will not do business. Now, the same test is being put on Rouhani, and of course, as we know, Ahmadinejad rejected all of that. He was cast as a villain and a meanie and a demon and one of the new Hitlers of the 21st century. And we saw that, how it plays out with Paul Tepetti's group and the band Poker Face, and how Gun Owners of America was placated and sought out and said, you can't go there, Larry Pratt, you can't go to that event, Freedom Palooza, because now, if you want to support mainstream and be in the mainstream of the media as a legitimate opponent of gun control in that dialectic, then you have to cut ties. You have to cut ties, and you have to join this new world order. You have to be accepted. And the key to that acceptance is you must reject anyone who debunks the Holocaust, whether they are, in fact, Jews or not, who have indeed been exponents of historical revisionism in that regard. So you see, it doesn't matter who says what. It's the message. And the message is, you must do business by accepting that cornerstone of our very existence, they claim, and that is the Holocaust. As illogical as that is, that this state in the Middle East, which condemned and murdered, extorted and exterminated and violated and in any way possible, wherever possible, annihilated its opponents, should have a unique spot in history and in the Middle East simply because it supposedly was established upon those very, very facts, okay, as they call them, all right? So it doesn't make sense. It obviously is the antithesis of logic and the antithesis of all human reasoning. Why would you do to others what you say has been done to you and call that freedom and democracy? There's something wrong with that. Well, Rouhani, of course, did not meet with Mr. Obama today. And, supposedly it was because of the wine being served at the dinner, and then, there were other reasons, obviously, advanced. But when he does, and I'm sure he will be meeting with Obama, their puppet, that he will have to first, before he wants to have relations with the United States, not do anything that would please the people of the United States and their perceptions of Iran. But he must first please Israel. He must first please the synagogue of Satan. Now, doesn't that tell you who's in control of foreign policy? Why, it sure does. That alone would tell you. You don't even need to go any further. So, we will continue, of course, to see these events play out, and we will see more overtures for peace and more overtures for the end of war and disarmament, of course, all of these things in this very deceiving era that we live in. Quite frankly, oh yes, there will be wars, and there will be rumors of wars, too, fear-mongering, in order to get the people to surrender to a world-governing body. And that body will be out of Jerusalem, especially when that temple arises and Satan appears in that temple. Now, we hear more and more about this alleged mall massacre in Kenya, and I say it again, alleged, as you could peruse yourself, anybody that, without any partiality whatsoever, who sees the interviews given tonight by one of the survivors, quote unquote, on NBC, can see clearly a group of actors and actresses, crisis actresses, as we have seen out of the Boston Marathon explosions, alleged explosions, as we saw with Santa Monica, and of course, as we have seen coming from the original hit at Sandy Hook. You can just watch the insincerity and the almost amusing reading of script lines by some of these people, one lady in particular. It was so apparent to myself that I was actually laughing out loud, I have to tell you. I do that quite a bit, But I do that because, again, we were shown these horrific scenes of what purportedly took place. People lying down, people supposedly dead, bullets flying in the air, cameras focused on ceilings, and yet nothing that smacked of reality. I wonder why, huh? We'll come back.
You are tuned in to the Republic Broadcasting Network. Visit our website by going to republicbroadcasting.org.
The New World Order thought police are on the run because Rick Adams is back on the Republic Broadcasting Network.
Are you going to back me up? I told you I know my job. Is it your job? It's what the rule book says. I want a straight answer. I'll get fired for it. But there's other towns and other jobs. Yeah, sure. I'll back you up.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to note that. As we come back, folks, you know, there was this little huff and puff session here with John McCain that was videoed and is online when, of course, certain of his constituents were berating him about his ridiculous statements of war with regard to Syria and his accusations against Assad in the Syrian government. And apparently, of course, it is something that has been a formal rebuke, John McCain, by one of the officials there. And I was just listening to a little bit of it before I came on. But maybe I could just see if we can grab a glitch of it here. Let's see.
But for far too long now, and the rest of Congress, including the executive branch of government, along with the judicial and legislative, have turned your back on the American people and their core values and principles. I can say with great confidence and speak on behalf of all Americans that your actions against this country are treasonous. All of you, like the American people, have aided and abetted the enemy. You and the rest of Congress, including the President of the United States, have went against the will of your people in Syria of your position and vote, whether it is a yes or no, is still a political smokescreen, I believe. Wholeheartedly, you do not care about the will and well-being of the America or its people. You lied to the American people about the chemical attacks in Syria. The American people know that it was most likely responsible. There is strong evidence, including video, that these attacks were carried out by Al-Qaeda, and you advocate starting a war, even maybe world war, by taking the same attack and blaming it on Assad. President Barack Hussein Obama has been supporting terrorism. The United States has been funding and aiding organizations, including the Muslim Brotherhood and Al-Qaeda, for many years now. The same enemy we're supposed to be defeating on the battlefield. At least one country in this world stood up against this government terrorism that you guys support in Egypt. The people of Egypt throughout Mohammed Morsi, which Obama supported as well, as countless Christians have lost their lives under evil people such as this. You swore an oath to protect us and protect from all enemies, both foreign and domestic. The simple irony is the domestic enemy now in this country is the people and government of the United States. And McCain and you and the rest of our leaders are accountable for their actions. It's too bad someone like me is not in office to hold you accountable. Because if I was in a position of power or authority, I would have you all arrested and tried for treason against my country under the grounds of 18 U.S.C. 2381 treason U.S. Code. Whoever owing allegiance to the United States levies war against them or adheres to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort within the United States or elsewhere, is guilty of treason. That is the code. The American people are sick of it. This country rose up against you recently. The ratio, hang on, I have a right of free speech, I can finish. The American people opposed to going to war with Syria, which includes many Marines and other veterans by the thousands, was 499 to 1. That is 99% of the people of this country. So if you and the rest of this government are truly for the American people and representatives of us, I suggest this time you listen, because nobody wants another war or strike in Syria or anywhere else. Bring our brothers and sisters home. I am truly disgusted that you people are my leaders.
Well, that's about all the clip right now that I'm going to play. He's addressing McCain there in a forum right at the particular room where this is being held. And apparently, now some of what he says, of course, is also in error, but nevertheless, his general charges are true against the Congress and against John McCain in particular, who is a warmonger, and he is working on behalf of those interests, the radical Jewish jihadists, whom he's married to in his family, and who have received or given him a very large quantity of money, to his campaign through their various political action committee fronts. So he knows He knows how to dance when the piper calls the tune. Let's put it that way. But it was refreshing, and is refreshing, to hear somebody in an area, a congressional district, in a state, addressing his senator. I know our senators here usually spend more time away from the state in Israel and Europe and everywhere minding the world's business, but back home in their state. And I know that part of that is because in the past they have not received a very warm welcome at open meetings. And when they have these community forums and get out and meet the folk, usually it gets a little too hot in the kitchen, you see. And with Mr. Truman, who admitted that if you can't stand the heat, then you should get out of the kitchen. In these cases, these fellas in my area anyway don't like getting near the kitchen door. So you have to give McCain credit for one thing, is that he's held a few forums here, he's met with a few, and he's faced his constituents somewhat face to face. And you have to give the devil his due. And, hope and certainly pray that his day will come. There's no question he will be held accountable, but not by the people. Not by the people of Arizona. He will be held accountable by a much higher authority for his actions and for his fellowship and consorting with those unfruitful works of darkness. That you can pretty much count on, folks. I will guarantee you that. So, the new FBI director has focused now on homegrown extremism threat, so he calls it. We've been talking about this for a long time, haven't we? The new director, Mr. Comey, James Comey, has stated now that terrorism has become his focus. Specifically, the threats of Al-Qaeda affiliates worldwide and at home in this violent extremism in the United States. Now, of course, you know that one thing that came out of this latest staged event in Kenya happens to be this link, or this alleged link of Americans to this attack. Now, that was obviously not just a mistake. It was not just a slip of hand. I mean, it was a revelation of the game plan of the synagogue of Satan. What they intend to do is to create a violent terrorist assault here in the United States, and then to claim that certain Americans were involved in that attack. And they were involved in the planning and the carrying out of that attack, and they have links to Iran, they have links to Rouhani, they have links to Syria, they have links to radical Islam, and they are super patriot types. Now, we've seen that. We've seen it before. 2 years ago, we saw this setting up of the Holocaust Museum bomber, and we've also seen other incidents similar, in which the Southern Poverty Law Center, Modi's and Company, and Mr. Potok, as well as the ADL, have been warning America through Chertoff and his family of friends, through Homeland Security particularly, that we do face a new enemy, and that enemy, yes, is here at home. Why, isn't that mighty convenient, huh? Sure is. That's exactly what the script calls for. Remember when 9/11 happened and they blamed these so-called Arabs and so-called Muslims on planes and said they were all part of a conspiracy, a new boogeyman, a new Hitler to attack America and their freedoms, when all of a sudden, it was that enemy within. The enemy that calls it our friend, calls itself our best ally, our best defense, and our best friend, and particularly the friend of the Christians. They want more than anything to convince these fundamentalists today and others that they are their defenders for Jehovah. And yet they are the enemy within. The enemy's at the gates, you see, but now the enemy has traveled across the gates. He's inside the fortress, my friends. Isn't it about time you wake up? Okay, we'll come back with more, and we'll take your calls. Nothing as corrupt as that city, that town of D.C.
Man's got to live with his own conscience.
Oh, yeah.
This town's hiding something. I want to know what it is.
A big, rotten stench, and you didn't smell anything.
That's the way it is, folks, isn't it, huh? Well, we smell it, we see it, we observe it, and we know it. And we know who is involved directly in it. So there's no excuse anymore. I mean, the handwriting is on the wall. We know what's going to happen. Here in America, we're seeing it now, and this is the key. This country must be brought down unless or until such a time as the whole world system is brought under control of these Talmudic influences. So they need to bring us down. And, of course, that's something we're going to have to involve ourselves in, too, as part of that equation, which is what? Well, it's the so-called Obamacare law. And if we don't see, and we won't, the Republicans mount, despite the efforts of one or two like Ted Cruz, a successful effort to deep six Obamacare, we are already being told of a massive amount of layoffs that be taking place starting in January for the little menial jobs because employers do not wish to pay for it. Some have already signed off. They've had their employees sign off on Obamacare and given them the responsibility. Others are simply downsizing, cutting employees, eliminating the hours, and so forth. So you see, all of this is no accident, and it's not to help make affordable health care. It's certainly quite the contrary. It's to continue to destroy individualism, economic freedom, the self-sustainability of the individual and the family, in order that these Talmudic devils can come in and take over everything. And that's what they're aiming to do. All right, I will take a few calls right now as time permits. 800-313-9443 is the number. That's 800-313-9443. Barry is up first. Hello, Barry.
Hey, Rick.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome, Barry.
You know what's been bothering me is I see all these emails, I see all these videos about Putin, how the American people are praising him and all that. And I think it's a surface thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think all these leaders are actually working together. And it's just one big show.
Uh-huh.
They know what's going to happen.
Yep.
You know?
I don't have any real faith in any Republican in Senate or in the House in Washington. I hate to sound that pessimistic and that nihilistic, but I'm realistic also.
I just don't trust Putin. It looks good on the surface, but I heard he's a 33-degree Mason,
mm-hmm.
and he went to Israel and he's kissing butt over there.
Oh, yes.
I don't know. I just don't
buy into it at all. Just recognize that, as I said, he was surrounded by enemies from within and without the camp. You know, even within our own brethren, they're willing to consort with the devil and the devil's children. And that was Jeremiah's lament, and Isaiah and Daniel. They all, in captivity. Daniel wrote about these things because he was in captivity and he was told to write these things, and what would befall us in the last days would be exactly the same. It's the same MO and the same pattern. You know, Barry?
Yeah, and the other thing that bothers me is like on GCN and even on Republic Broadcasting, there's some that are pointing the finger at the Muslims.
Well, it's fashionable. You know, we understand that. And, you know, I expect that. You're going to hear a lot more of that, you know, because it's just popular not to tell the truth and to engage in that go along to get along mentality. But, you know, it's expected. It's expected. Yeah. Don't expect to hear the truth.
If you can't point out who really is behind all this, which is the Jews, which is the Zionists, and I'm sorry, but Judaism is not in the Bible. It is not in the Bible. They use the Talmud above the Bible, and most of them don't use the Bible. They use the Talmud. And then they got the Kabbalists also. But, you know, and then you got all these churches that are bamboozled by them. And it's just a sad state of affairs in our country. I mean, if you can't, you know, and if you try to talk about it, they're like, how dare you talk about Israel like that? Well, it isn't Israel. I can talk about all I want. That's not true Israel. Your eyes are still shut to the truth. Mm-hmm. That's the problem.
And that may be a blessing for some, too, you know, because they can't handle the truth, you know. You know, I mean, they just can't take it. Many of the people we know in our own families and friends, you know, cannot handle it if they knew it. So they're not accountable. I just see them as being ignorant and not informed, and for their own good. For their own good, because only the men can do a man's job. You can't send a child to do a man's job. It's just that simple. Not in this era.
I just had to get that off my chest, Rick. I'll get off so someone else.
All right, thank you. That's good. Thank you for your emails and your videos and your uplinks. I appreciate them as well on YouTube.
Thank you, Rick.
Yes, thank you, Barry.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Art is up in Philadelphia. Hello, Art.
Hello, Rick. Thank you for taking my call. Mm-hmm. I wanted to point out something that's starting to evolve with regards to these charter schools. We had yesterday in Philadelphia Eric Cantor come here and basically cite that creating the charter schools in Philadelphia was a great success, and he plans to support that activity throughout the entire United States in every school district. And he's opposing the lawsuit by the state of Louisiana, where they have literally now 50% of all the schools in the state of Louisiana under control of charter schools. Mm-hmm. And it's basically the issue is they're fighting why should public debt be responsible for paying private profit. This started in a big way in Philadelphia, and we see the consequences where that we have like 1/3 of all the public schools teachers being put out of work while they're basically feeding the pigs in the trough.
Well, you know, that's the funny thing. You mentioned charter schools. They've been everywhere in my state, and they have advanced with some opposition from the unions, but I don't support the public school system, obviously. I want to see it abolished, and I do want to see it put into the hands of the parents' education and those who can pay for it and will pay for it if they're not taxed to support the government school system. Well, that's the way it should be. That's the way it was. But in the meantime, this charter school movement is really a pseudo-private exercise, and what it does is actually strengthens the public school system in the long run.
Yeah, it may.
That's what it does.
But what's going on, the point I'm trying to make, is the majority of these charter schools are basically being backed by Eric Cantor, Sheldon Adelson, and the Chicago
Syndicate. Types, sure.
Yeah, and they're bankrupting the communities. Okay,
Yep.
I mean, it's one thing. I like the idea of vouchering and getting basically going back to low-deal titles and getting the having the people use the schools go back to the tuition system. But I don't think the solution is to hire the mob to basically come in here and make all these private schools and tax the living heck out of everybody.
Isn't it funny how they managed to get the contracts, they managed to get the bus contracts, Laidlaw and so forth, and what we've talked about so many times on this program with you is just another example of how this particular mob, this Cosa Nostra, is infiltrating all aspects of the most important parts of our family life, and that is the children. To get control of the minds of the children, bankrupt the community, and enrich themselves.
Yes. And we saw that up in Bridgeport, Connecticut, going on there with Paul Vallis, the superintendent of schools up there, who's the one who sat over the city of Philadelphia when they wrecked the schools. And then he went down to Louisiana. He wrecked the schools down there. And now he's up in Bridgeport, Connecticut, doing the same thing.
Isn't that amazing? Well, he goes from one town to another. Huh? We've seen that up my way, too. All right. Well, unfortunately, I'm out of time. Good points, Art, as always. Thank you. Yeah. All right. Well, we're out of time, folks. God willing, again, we'll see you tomorrow. And we will wish you all a blessed week as we continue with the mission of truth. Good night, everyone.